The three of us are from the Center on Child Abuse and Neglect, which is located in the Department of Pediatrics as Gall said, at the University of Oklahoma Health Sciences Center. My name is Tricia Gardner. I am a licensed attorney and associate professor within our section. We also have joining us today Debra Hecht and Susan Schmidt, both of whom are licensed psychologists and also within our section. So we typically provide a training every year at our annual conference on ethics in child maltreatment. We know it's a difficult issue. There are a lot of gray areas in this field, and we have tried to put this lecture into an online format, and we will do our best to share information. We are going to have a couple of questions here at the beginning that we just want you to think about, and you can respond to the chat at any time. When one of us is talking, the other two will be monitoring the chat and will be able to let us know. And then we're going to have some more lecture-based pieces, and then we're going to have a couple of scenarios. So to get started, and then now I can't make my slides go forward. Yay, that's exciting. Gall told me not to stop touch anything, so I stopped touching things, and so now it's not working. So just to get a feel for our audience, if you guys could respond on the chat bar, how long you've been working with families impacted by child maltreatment. The three of us are all in the 11 years plus, but I'm not going to say how long that has been because we don't want you to know how old we are. We're all 29. And so if you guys could just let us know how many years you've been in the field, that would be great. And I can say, having been in the field for more than 11 years, I think you think you've seen everything, and then it turns out that that's not true. There are continually new situations, new things happening to children, new things happening with families like COVID that we've never experienced before. So it's a continual learning curve for all of us to be involved in this field. Are one of you guys looking at the chat? Can you give it a scan and see what our audience looks like, please, before I move on to the next slide?
The majority of folks have got like 10+ years.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. Good. Y'all can teach us and we can be quiet for the rest of the day. That's amazing.
From 0 to 40 is what I've seen so far.
I saw 64.
Oh.
Wow, you guys are amazing. Well, we're glad you're here, and we will do our best to talk about something new today. So now this first question is about how confident you feel navigating ethical issues sans COVID. So just in general, how comfortable do you feel dealing with ethical situations that arise in your work involving child maltreatment? You can rate it on a scale from 1 to 10. You can say, I feel comfortable. You can say, I feel uncomfortable. Whatever suits you best for that particular question. So we'll give you a couple of seconds to respond to the chat for that. And if we were smart enough, we would have implemented the poll option in Zoom, but we haven't quite accomplished that task yet, so we apologize. How do people feel about ethical issues in child maltreatment, you guys?
Looks like most are in the 7 to 8 range. There's a few 4s and 5s.
Awesome. That's about typical, I would say, for our audience that we have in previous presentations that we've done. All right, so now the next question. How confident do you feel in this time of COVID in navigating ethical issues? Because we've had some new scenarios come up that we never thought we would have to face previously with this whole situation.
Numbers are dropping a little bit.
Yeah, a lot more 4s and 5s.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we've been seeing. Not surprised about those answers. So we're all in the same boat together, learning something new. That's great. And is this one still me, guys? Since I'm sharing my screen, I can't look at our, okay. So what is one example of a professional ethical challenge you've experienced or heard about since COVID-19?
Yeah, we're
And
going
I
to
can,
ask you to type in some scenarios, and then we will circle back around to those during the last phase of our call together.
and I know that Gal said we'd have like 15 minutes at the end of the presentation for questions, but really, if you guys have any questions as we go along, one of us will always be monitoring the chat, and we're more than happy to bring that forward. But if you do have some particular scenarios that you would like us to talk about toward the end, just please put those in the chat, and we will bring those back around when we get to that part of our presentation. So I'm going to pass this on to Dr. Hecht, I believe.
Yeah. So really, when we talk about this, these are, again, kind of just basic ethical principles that come up no matter what discipline you are. Beneficence and non-malfeasance, that you're going to do good for your clients, for the families and people that you serve, and try not to do harm or minimize the harm that you're going to do. Fidelity and responsibility, that you're aware as a professional, you have a responsibility to society and to the profession to uphold your professional standards of conduct, and to have trust. Integrity, when you're working especially with families and with children, no matter what role you have, and I notice there's a wide variety of professions here, which is fantastic. We're really excited about that.
Pause real quick. Someone had communicated that we're not seeing the PowerPoint, we're only seeing Trish.
Oh.
Although I'm seeing the PowerPoint.
I'm seeing PowerPoint too. Okay. So I'll keep talking while Trish works on fixing that.
Really?
Integrity.
It may be that there's a dual, sometimes there's a dual view. So for whoever's having trouble with that, it may be that you've got two views going on. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so integrity, that basically you are developing a trusting relationship with the families and the children that you're working with, and that you're respectful of that, and you're doing what you're going to say you're going to do, that you're portraying what you can do for a family accurately and honestly. And justice, that you treat all people equally, fairly, and impartially. I know sometimes that's hard with some of the families we work with, but everybody has the right to be treated fairly and equally. And respect for people's rights and dignity. Sometimes people make decisions that we don't agree with. They have the right to make that decision, to have that autonomy within themselves, and also respecting the rights to privacy and confidentiality within a case. So those are basic things that should guide all of us when we work in our professional roles. And sometimes working in the field of child maltreatment, there's specific challenges that come up with respect to these principles. And especially now in the time of COVID, there's additional challenges that come up. And so we're going to spend our time talking about that, but really like to remind folks when we talk about ethics and start going through scenarios to keep these things in mind, because this is always should be in the forefront of your decision making of, am I holding true to these principles? Okay, Trish.
Yep. So there are basically 3 levels of issues that keep us in line as we move through this profession. Above all else, there are laws that everyone within the United States have to follow. And then you have federal law, you have state law, you have local law, all that if you break that law, you could be in serious trouble. So we suggest following the law when at all possible. But then also all of us in this field have some sort of professional ethics, whether it's me with the Bar Association, whether it's Dr. Hecht and Dr. Schmidt through the Oklahoma Psychological Association, LPC, LMFT, social work. There are all a set of guidelines out there for all of us to follow. And sometimes that can get muddled and hard to do if it pushes up against a law or if it pushes up against a moral feeling that you have about what you should do in a particular situation. But you have to follow those professional guidelines in order to keep your license and not get in trouble with your licensing board. And then again, like I mentioned just a second ago, there are personal issues that arise in ethical dilemmas. What you should do based on what the law and your professional ethics tell you to do, and what you feel like you need to do in order to follow your personal ideas about a particular situation. All of these things have to come together when you're in an ethical dilemma, and that sometimes is what causes it to be gray. So understanding the hierarchy of the importance of these things, law is the highest because that can lead to charges against you if you don't follow the law. Your professional ethics then need to be followed in order to maintain your licensure in this area. And then your personal issues sometimes, unfortunately, may come last depending on the situation itself. Anybody had either one of you guys have anything to add to that? No? Is this me too? I think it is. So one of the things that we have to look at, again, it may not be necessarily right or wrong, but looking at all of the ethics that are having to deal with the situation and keeping your personal biases and beliefs in mind as you're dealing with an issue. Families may not feel the same way that you do about corporal punishment. And if they're interested in spanking and you feel like that's not something that you can support, maybe that's not the family that you should be working with. All of us come to the table with some sort of bias and belief in mind, and we have to remember that that's not the only thing that is guiding us in these situations. We have to consider likely outcomes of our actions. So if we are working with a family and we're concerned about what's going on in that family, taking into consideration the safety of if you address a situation right then and they have to return home and there'll be no one overseeing them, what's that going to look like? What is the impact that it's going to have when you move forward with a family on your decisions, and all the rules and mandates of your profession, like we talked about, all have to come into play. What are the confidentiality issues? Where does informed consent come in? When does mandatory reporting apply? None of these issues are simple. All of them can be stressful, not only for the family, but for the provider. And one of the things that we talk about, and we'll get to in a few minutes, is the importance of having other professionals that you can talk to. And you don't have to violate confidentiality necessarily to have a conversation with a colleague about an issue that is concerning to you. And we all reach out to one another within our office, and we really, really, really encourage you to find other people in your profession that you can lean on when you have these situations. It's hard to make these decisions in a vacuum. And so having colleagues that you trust and can rely on are really, really critical in these decisions. And the final word is, where does the buck stop? Where is the issue that you're not comfortable addressing or not addressing? And when does it come to that? And when that buck stops, what are you going to do about that particular situation? How are you going to handle that? Who are you going to reach out to? And how are you going to make that decision? Is this me too? It is. Okay. So the things that you have to do is define the parameters of your ethical scenario. Who are the entities are involved? How many different agencies are involved? Who are the different people involved? And so what do you have to do? based on the law and the guidance of your particular profession? And then what would you like to do? And how are you going to mesh those if they're on opposite ends of the spectrum? How are you going to deal with that situation? And define your parameters in the role that you're playing. Am I being an attorney and representing the child? Am I being an attorney and representing the parents? What can I do and what is my role? It's critical to know what your role is. Who is your client? Are you working for DHS? Are you working for the child? Are you working for yourself? And what do your professional ethics tell you that you can do in that type of situation? And based on the answers to the first two of those, or the first two steps, then what are your tactics on how to tackle the situation that you have in front of you? And we thought this was important because depending on the circumstances, you may have to change your tact or your path in a particular issue with a particular family. We're not saying that you throw ethics out the window at all, but sometimes they have to change based on what's happening in front of you.
Okay, so like I said, thank you all for responding about who you are and where you're from, and we're thrilled that there's a multidisciplinary audience here. I think it's true in most of the professions we're in that you deal with other disciplines, but I think it's especially true in child maltreatment. You have child welfare, you have the law, you have the lawyers, the attorneys for the children, for the parents, you have foster parents involved, CASA. There's often physical consequences of abuse where you have doctors, medical doctors involved, you have psychologists and therapists involved. So just inherent from what child maltreatment is, you're going to be working in a multidisciplinary setting, whether or not you're specifically a member of a multidisciplinary team. Okay, Trish.
Oh, sorry. I was looking at the chat.
So thinking about this multidisciplinary collaboration, we think it's a really important thing because that's sometimes where ethics kind of come into play. So the whole context of having a multidisciplinary collaboration, whether it's a formal team or not, is trying to address problems which are beyond the scope or expertise of any one professional. So like Trish alluded to, we're consulting with each other all the time. And that's often across disciplines, not just within psychology or social work. And you have to balance the responsibilities and what your knowledge and values are with your distinct role. So knowing what is your role on this case. And ethically, every professional has separate obligations based on their profession and role. And you also have an obligation to treat other professionals with respect and act professionally. So for child welfare cases, it's important to remember that child welfare ultimately is responsible for the safety of the child. And so relationships across professionals are not always equal with respect to the family involved. So I've had situations where I've been involved in consulting with cases where I haven't ultimately agreed with the decision child welfare made, but I have to accept that it wasn't my decision to make. I can state my opinion, give reasons for that opinion, but I cannot do anything because I am not responsible for the child welfare is. And so understanding that is really important when working in these multidisciplinary settings. So taking into effect, oh, no, go back, please.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Taking into effect what Trish talked about before, when you're approaching a case, you are going to think about what is your role, who's involved, what do I want to do, what do I have to do, what's your role, and how are you going to work together. So we can go ahead and go through the scenario and kind of, please feel free to use the chat. Normally in person, we'd be calling on people. But think about this, you're working on a multidisciplinary team, and you've got one of the following roles, and probably we've got everybody represented here: child welfare, ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, foster care agencies, mental health providers, or a director of the team. And the child and child welfare custody and is engaging in non-suicidal self-injury, and the foster parents have been reluctant to see this as a concern. They haven't acted on any of the recommendations to enhance the safety of this child. So who's ultimately responsible for making a decision and deciding if this child is safe or not? How might your role on the team affect what you think the next steps are? And who should offer the ultimate guidance? Who should be the loudest voice on the team? So I'll give you a minute to think about that and post your answers.
Nobody wants to answer because it's a really hard question.
So, you know, thinking about it from a child psychologist position, one of the things that I fear the most, I do not want to see in a case, is self-injurious behavior. That's what keeps me up at night. Especially when I'm in a situation where I am not confident that the caregivers are going to do what they need to do to protect that child. And so I certainly, I'm going to have some very strong opinions, and that might rankle some of the people on the team. Working on a lot of multidisciplinary teams, I understand how precious foster care placement settings are, and that we do not want to disrupt that placement for a multitude of reasons, and that that is certainly a strong consideration in this case. And so it is difficult. So some of the comments, it's child's welfare custody, the buck stops with them. Yes, ultimately it does. Good question, does the child have a guardian ad litem? So having a go ahead, Tricia.
A guardian ad litem can be very helpful in these cases, but depending on where you are, particularly if you're in a rural area, which we know we have a lot of that in Oklahoma, identifying a GAL can be very difficult. They may not have any, but I certainly would encourage anyone that would be involved in a case like this to ask if a guardian ad litem could be appointed, and they may be able to find one. So if there's not one, I think that could be very helpful in this type of situation. Absolutely would support that.
And so it's child welfare. There's a lot here that say the mental health provider and child welfare need to work together, which is a great answer. I think it is up to the mental health provider to relay the seriousness and the concerns that they have in a way that can be heard by child welfare and the foster parents. I don't know if Dr. Schmidt, you have anything to add?
No, I would agree with that, and I appreciate what everyone's saying about maybe the largest portion of the buck stops with child welfare, given that the child's in custody, but that we all have a little bit of change in the process, right? So mental health, we have our specific obligations, et cetera. So we all have some responsibility, and ultimately child welfare has the kind of ultimate say when it comes to the safety of the child.
And I do want to reiterate what Dr. Hecht said just a second ago. As a mental health provider and being concerned about the welfare of a child, and this could be significantly serious, finding a way to communicate with the child welfare worker is crucial. And again, we may not always agree with the decisions that child welfare comes to, but they ultimately, I think, right in this situation when a child is in state custody, that child welfare is where the buck stops because they make those recommendations. But doing what we can to educate them about mental health issues, the seriousness of what that issue could be and could lead to. I think sometimes child welfare is at a disadvantage because we expect them to be experts in everything, and they can only learn so much, and they're going out and working in these really stressful situations. And so I think it's our responsibility as professionals in the field of child maltreatment to help enhance their education, but do it in a way that's not condescending or rude or being, I don't know, argumentative with them. So establishing a good relationship with your child welfare providers in your area is crucial to helping these children and the families ultimately.
Right, knowing how to provide that education and to child welfare to help them inform their decision making, and also I think knowing how to advocate for that youth and their needs, and how to elevate your concerns, your communications throughout the kind of child welfare pathway as well, I think can be a very important thing.
And I really like, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I really like this last comment on the chat about potentially considering moving the child from the placement. Again, that could be an option, particularly if the information is falling on deaf ears when you're talking to the foster parents. But again, depending on where you're located, it could be really hard to find another placement for that child. But that too would be a consideration and a conversation that you might have with the child welfare worker about the best placement for this child, and is this foster family ultimately going to be able to make the right decision to help them.
Yeah, I remember one time I was talking with a colleague about this particular issue related to self-injury, suicidal ideation, and just the different levels of risk tolerance that each of us have within our own profession, across professions, and just being able to make that an explicit and open conversation to recognize where one another comes from in your perspective, in your level of tolerance for what might be considered this self-injury behavior.
Deb, what were you going to say next one?
I was just going to say, in the interest of time, I think we'll probably skip the second example, but there is another example of a scenario for your reading pleasure.
It has the word sex in it. So for your reading pleasure, there's another scenario.
And then just a little levity. Sometimes this can be a lot. I always like Calvin and Hobbes.
Always. All right, Dr. Schmidt.
Yeah, so let's move forward in talking ethics in this era, the new era that we're finding ourselves in. You know, some of our colleagues have stepped into this area of virtual service provision earlier than the COVID-19 dilemma, and we find ourselves learning a lot from them, their experiences, their lessons learned, and so appreciative of that. So I'd like for us to spend some time reflecting, talking together, and I'm going to give the caveat that I think we within our program are also just absolutely in the midst of learning and growing in this respect ourselves as well. And so I certainly welcome your comments, your questions, your expertise. When I was looking at the concerns that you have about this COVID-19 time period and ethics, majority of them came from this area of virtual service provision and making sure that we're making good quality and safe and appropriate decisions about service provision during this time period. But then also, I think, what does this mean for incorporating this technology into our repertoire of services? I know, at least from our center, this is, I think, helping us grow in a way that maybe we were hesitant to do so before. And so we are really envisioning that this is going to bring a new modality of service to our repertoire of services that we're providing. So we're not only thinking about how do we, as quickly as possible, make the best decisions now to provide these services, but also recognizing that we're laying a pathway for these larger and longer term decisions regarding our services as well. So there are some existing guidelines that are out from different associations. The APA has a particular page on their website dedicated to some recommendations, encouragements, and guidelines when envisioning service provision in this virtual format. And so understandably, if we think back to the slide that Trish identified earlier, where we've got the law, we've got our own ethical standards, our own personal guidelines and professional requirements, we see the same thing here as well, that we're beholden to legal requirements with regard to virtual service provision. And we've seen during this COVID time that there was a quick relaxing of, say, for example, HIPAA guideline or requirements so that we can get services out. And I think there will be, now that we're not in the sprint phase as much anymore, we're starting to move into this, longer term vision for services. I'm sure there's going to be a return back to revisiting what standards have we released or relaxed, and what do we need to do to make sure that we are meeting our confidentiality needs. We have our ethical standards and guidelines that we need to meet. We also are in the midst of learning just this telecommunication platform and what the limitations are, what the capacities are. We're growing ourselves in this respect. And then we have our own agencies and programs and are trying to meet those requirements. And I don't know about you guys, but I know I found, particularly during the first 2 to 3 weeks, that was an absolute moving target, that they would say, well, you have to have this form, or you have to have this in your contacts or communications, or this is how you document. And it seemed like, every day there was something new or different or contradictory, and trying to just make sure that we were as much as possible meeting these new obligations and requirements. Finding those starting to smooth out some, but again, we're looking at the marathon now instead of the sprint. And so what are the policies and procedures that we need to put in place now?
Well, and I would add to that one of the things that we've struggled with on our campus is that we're a medical institution. And so a lot of the guidance and materials and telehealth options that they were starting out with was all really medically focused. And the particular platform that we began to work with, it became quickly clear that it was not going to be helpful for our mental health services that we were trying to provide. And so it was great for a quick medical discussion and that type of thing, but involving a caregiver into the discussion, or allowing for activities on a whiteboard or other services that we typically have in our mental health provision were not going to be applicable to this platform that they were providing us. So we as mental health professionals had to band together and express to the university that this is not going to be the best thing. If you want us to work in a telehealth environment, you're going to have to support us in opening up other options, which they did. And I'm pleased to say that. But that too was an ethical issue with our oversight in making sure that we were still following the standards that they set for confidentiality and those other requirements, because we don't want to get in trouble as an institution by not protecting the people that we're working with. But again, it had to be balanced out with being able to provide those services in a way that worked.
Thank you. So going back to those core ethical standards, one of the first pieces that we have to consider here is doing no harm. We want to do some good, but we want to make sure that we're doing no harm. And the interventions that we are looking to provide, can they be provided safely, appropriately, to fidelity standards within this new telehealth format? So I think for many of us, it's been looking at our own experience of those interventions and exploring what aspects of this lend itself well to this virtual format, what aspects may not. We want to make sure that we're not setting up families for something that could be problematic or challenging. We're looking to, when possible, the developers of these models or others who've been doing this work before us to get their recommendations, their lessons learned in this. So let's first of all make sure that we are moving forward in a way that is going to meet those appropriate safety and fidelity standards within that particular service that we're going to provide. So one example of this may be in psychological assessment. And for those professionals who that is a greater portion of their livelihood, they're having to really think about, how do I provide this in a format that's going to fit well within this teleformat. And some aspects of psychological assessment can lend themselves well. I know, for example, for myself, where I do more trauma-focused work, and we had some questions initially about, can we do like a PTSD screener and symptom measure virtually, and how's that going to be impactful, and how do we make sure that we're attending to the impacts of that measure for that individual. We want to make sure it's safe, there's confidentiality, and we have found that we've got some capacity to be able to do that, and that the youth and the caregivers that we've provided those to have responded well to that. We also were a bit of ahead of the curve within our program in that we had these measures already embedded within an existing REDCap platform, so that we could pull that up, share screen on Zoom, and be able to administer it in that way. Not everyone is necessarily set up that way. But there are certainly certain measures that require more object manipulation or kind of direct kind of physical interaction that would not necessarily lend themselves well to this kind of a virtual administration. And so in those respects, we've had to think about what aspects of an assessment, for example, might we be able to do in this teleformat, and then what other aspects might be something that we're going to have to do a follow-up in-person meeting once we have the capacity to move back into that. So maybe this is a multi-phased type of assessment that we're doing at this point. And I'm sure that there are other examples. A parent-child interaction therapy, for example, was one where they had some reflection on their two distinct phases of PCIT, one that's more child-directed, one that's more parent-directed, where they're teaching more of a timeout process. And the child-directed phase lends itself actually very well, I think, to this virtual technology, but they've had to put some thought to should they, and if they do, how do they move into teaching and coaching in this more kind of physically active timeout modality. And so they're putting more collective thought around that. So some of the things that we need to think about, obviously, are have we assessed this family's capacity, their readiness, their technological capacity to be able to enter into these spaces? Are there any particular safety risks or otherwise that might suggest that this teleformat's not going to be sufficient or appropriate for this family? And then also, we do want to do some good. So do those benefits outweigh the risks that we may see for our families? And, you know, even though our interventions may not look quite the same as they would in person, could families still benefit from those? And I know in my world, we do a lot of TFCBT work, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, and we've found that we actually can, for the majority of kids, move into that with some modifications and adjustments. But there's some individuals, some kids, or some families where trying to do TFCBT in a virtual format really is not going to fit them, their need, their family's capacity at this point. And then another thing that you know, we've tried to attend to as well, another hat that I wear is working in a program for adolescents who've been adjudicated delinquent due to illegal sexual behavior. And so there's a mandate to court treatment, and we initially found ourselves trying to figure out how do we meet that youth's probationary requirements and needs, and how are we continuing to maintain some form of service. And we were doing that in a bit of a placeholder fashion while we were trying to figure out how to shift and adjust our intervention to be able to be provided within this virtual format. We had initially, our program was based primarily on a group format, and we thought that we can't effectively transition into a virtual group at this point. We thought there were too many risks involved in that at that point. And so how do we transition to individual and family in the course of this? And we have since done that. But it took a bit of time for us to make sure that we were making some good decisions around that and really effectively moving into providing this.
Susan, can I just add to that too?
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of the families I'm consulting with and sit on multidisciplinary teams with too, the court is mandating that certain treatments happen during this time. And I mean, decisions on visitation and children returning home are based on completion of these services. And the families don't physically have the ability to do it. They live in a part of the state where there's not good internet access. So even if they had a device that they could connect to virtual visits, they don't have the internet or the phone connection to be able to do that. And so what does that mean? You know, and what we've really struggled with is the providers that are able to get through to them, usually by phone, is helping them keep their spirits up, their hope alive, when it's through no fault of their own that their case is being stalled.
Right.
And that is a really tough situation that a lot of providers are dealing with.
Right, right. I'll say too, we found it really helpful to reach out to our probation officers and our leads to ask them what information would be beneficial for them, for us to review, to gain from families during even those phone contacts when we started out, to make sure that we were getting good communication to the probation officers to help support them in their monitoring of these families. And so that was a very critical conversation to have, I think, and really brought their voice into the process too, so that we were making sure that families weren't caught in the middle of this. But I was also just recently, even this morning, I was on consultation with a therapist who's doing TFCBT, and she has decided to pause in moving forward in the model because she's only able to do those phone-based communications. And so it is supporting that continued coping during this time period before they move on to, are able to move back to in-person services.
We also got a comment on the chat that basically says, what this means is that the parties need to consider whether they can move forward at an increased timeline to return the children to the natural parents. And that's very true. And I think as providers, we also have to think of a way, and I think Dr. Schmidt already mentioned it, or maybe Dr. Hecht, but we have to be able to figure out a way to support these families when that happens, because that's going to be stressful for them. If they are really close to reunification and now everything's been put on hold, how frustrating and stressful is that going to be for that family? And how can we help them work through that and see the light at the end of the tunnel? When again, this was no fault of theirs that this all happened, but being able to deal with that is an issue that the providers are going to have to be able to address.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Were you done with the slide?
So informed consent. I don't know about you guys, but we have been working pretty feverishly. We as in not me, but other people like Trish and others, working feverishly to shift in our paperwork, our consent process, to make sure that we're incorporating this new technology and all the inherent risks that are involved in that. So we're looking at how do we do these virtual consents at this point? How do we relate those risks to confidentiality, to information security, and really choosing these platforms that have the lowest risk of violation of HIPAA standards. Initially I think Zoom, there were concerns that people were popping in to certain Zoom meetings, and our university pretty quickly, actually the Health Sciences Center, pretty quickly switched some of the overarching settings to Zoom, so that now there are different kinds of requirements for coming into meetings. And so, thinking on whatever platform you're utilizing, what are some of those additional safety standards that might be beneficial to be able to incorporate into your standard scheduling of appointments and requirements for either passwords, or like the virtual waiting room is one that just adds that added layer of security. We also had to look at how are we documenting this within our sessions. We had to work with the people who are doing our billing on how do we make sure that we are utilizing the right kinds of codes for the services that we're providing, so that they can most effectively document what we're providing.
Well, and to touch a little bit too on how the records and information will be stored, we had to have conversations with our staff that were now telecommuting about how they were going to protect personal health information when they were off campus. Usually we're not allowed to take that type of information off campus, but we're dealing with a whole new world. And so we had to make sure that everybody had a plan. They had to sign a form. They had to create a checklist of the records that they were taking home, so they could double check when they brought it back that everything actually was returned. We had to make sure that they either had a locking bag, a locking backpack, a locking box of some kind at their home, so that other people in their home can't access those records, because that would be a HIPAA violation. And so I think taking all that into consideration ahead of time before those records left campus was a big issue for us. We have about 150 people in our section, so we had to reach out to everybody to make sure that they realized the security issues that were going to have to be in place if they were going to be allowed to take that type of information home with them.
So now I'm going to read to you every single word on this slide. Okay, maybe not. This is just to show you that this was our quick rewrite of the consent for treatment process document, that now we had kind of clicking on the Zoom link means that I'm acknowledging all of these things. And how do we make sure that we communicate that to families so that they've got true informed consent in entering into this particular service. Okay, so confidentiality, it's not only about making sure that we have appropriate consent going into the service, but also recognizing that now on the other side of the screen, we have less control over who's there, over who's involved, who's listening, who's sitting out of view. It was, and I'm sure those of you guys who have been providing services, this is one of those things that has kept us up a little bit at night and trying to think about. And I think this fits for a variety of services, not just therapy, but it's in-home visitation services. It's you name it, and we lose that control. And with that, we may enhance some safety concerns. We may, we also may have concerns about the safety of that interaction that we're having with that client as well. There was a session recently I was supervising one of our clinicians on, and she said she had asked this team multiple times, if she was in this room by herself. The team said yes, yes, yes. And at some point, the team was in front of a big window, and the therapist, because there was a glare, had asked the team if they might be able to put down the screen. And immediately someone from out of the camera view came around and put the screen down. And the therapist thought, well, okay, so someone truly is in the room and they've been listening to this, despite the fact that I'd asked multiple times and the team had said no. So, it's almost like we have to make an assumption that there is that risk, that there is that potential that someone's in that room or is going to be able to hear through the door or have that access. And how do we make sure that we're minimizing safety risks related to interaction with that individual? Another situation recently that was a bit of a puzzler was a family that had limited capacity for privacy within their home. There were just a number of individuals there, not much space, and within the apartment itself, there wasn't a private space for a child to be meeting with a therapist. And so the therapist found out during the course of this session that the child was actually in the back seat of the family vehicle, and the parent had turned the car on had the windows up because they had the air conditioner on. They wanted the child to feel comfortable during that time, but the child was in the car all by themselves, and this was a grade schooler. And we just think, oh, okay, so, you know, well-intentioned caregiver, but increased safety risks in other ways for this child now to have their own privacy, but they're in a running car by themselves. And so how do we navigate with families these situations where either they just don't have the space or the capacity to be able to provide that safety for the individual that we're working with, or maybe there's inherent safety in that a family member may not allow that safety, that privacy to take place, and how do we navigate that?
And I think these are a couple of our questions that came up at the beginning. One person mentioned if it's a domestic violence situation, you don't know if the perpetrator of that violence is somehow listening to the session. And a couple of other people mentioned child welfare interaction and trying to check in with the child. But again, if it's a trial reunification and the parent is right there, are you truly getting the information that is happening in the home? And one comment we had here at the end is, I've had this happen with more than one client, and I'm not really sure we can do much until we're able to resume in-person sessions.
I mean, it can help a little bit if you have the capacity, if they have the capacity to have earbuds or something in, so they're the only one hearing you. They might be more monitored in what they're saying, but you can ask pointed questions. You know, it's not ideal, but it's a little bit better. But again, if you've got somebody really controlling, that probably isn't going to be allowed. But I'll echo from Trish, I've heard a lot from my child welfare partners in consultations and teams that it's not just about child reunification, but also this is an incredibly stressful time for foster care and for foster parents, and for them losing a lot of support and not being able to check in with the child about what's going on. Is that placement, you know, stable? What's going on is really concerning to a lot of folks too, and there's not a whole lot you can do about it at this point in time.
We also have a comment about whether or not the parent or the spouse could have set the device the client is using to record. So even if they're not in the room, they might still be able to record the session. And that is an issue that we have to be concerned about, unfortunately, in these new times.
Right, and in the process of our program, where we do a lot of groups, trying to make some decisions about, you know, longer term, do we have the capacity, or would we be willing to transition our services into kind of virtual groups? That was one of our greatest concerns, was screenshots, recordings, that we can't control that. And at present, we've not found a technological platform that allows for us to lock that down on the other side. Now, we do know that, like, we recently, we just got a little grant that's going to give us the money to purchase iPads for families who don't have the technology on their side. We're going to do that with some small data plans, and we have headphones so that there is a bit more privacy there. And we've been doing a lot of education and reading up on how can we lock down these devices so that that's all that they're accessing during the course of having these. For us, this is also particularly important given that we're going to be doing a lot of service provision to kids and kids who've engaged in problematic sexual behaviors, and want to make sure that we are limiting their capacity or their access to additional internet resources that maybe they shouldn't have access to as well. So, you know, important considerations as we think about this longer term service provision.
Well, and I certainly think in a group setting, when I participate in multidisciplinary team reviews, we always have a confidentiality statement that we have to sign when we go into the meeting. Even though I'm a member, every time I go to a meeting, we have a new confidentiality statement. And at the very least, having a confidentiality statement that could be reviewed at the beginning of a group session, of course, depending on the age of the children. But if you're working with caregivers or older kids, just talking about the importance of the confidentiality and recognizing that as an issue, and saying we're respecting each other's confidentiality, none of this information will be shared. Certainly wouldn't hurt anything to remind people about the importance of that.
And I think those who have moved forward in providing group services through a virtual format have done that. That's how they have stepped into it. But they also are assuming a certain level of risk inherent in that.
Right.
And I think that we would have to if we make that decision.
So it looks like we're down to 4 minutes. If anybody has a particular scenario that they would like us to talk about before we wrap up, we have a couple more slides to get to, but if anybody has a particular scenario that they'd like us to discuss, please put that on the chat.
Yeah, I'd rather almost, unless nobody has one, rather than our scenarios, use one of theirs.
Yeah,
so, and we have a couple examples, but I'd rather hear from you guys. Were there comments? I know, Susan, were you writing down earlier? Were there things from earlier that we didn't touch on?
There weren't specific scenarios. I saw more related to telehealth, Zoom, HIPAA safety. So I think that as a whole, individuals are finding themselves in the midst of navigating the same challenges with regard to HIPAA and safety as we are. Yeah.
So we do have this scenario here. I don't see that anybody has added anything to the chat. So you're providing an intervention to a youth and family via Zoom. The intervention involves seeing the youth alone for a portion of the session, the caregiver alone for a portion, and the youth and caregiver together for the remainder of the session. There is limited to no private space in the family home for the individual session time. So what are the key ethical considerations as a provider? I know we've already touched on some. Would you guys have anything else to add to that?
Well, and I might even just throw out how, have there been any creative ways that any individuals on today's presentation have navigated that, have collaborated with families in trying to create those pockets of privacy and confidentiality?
That doesn't involve putting a child in a running car.
Yeah, that'd be a good
That
one.
is certainly creative.
It was very well intentioned. And the child would have been happier, I have to say.
I do know that I have heard of a couple of situations where in discussing collaborating with the family, as it mentions here, that they've worked out the ability for the person that they want to have the first communication with goes outside and the other person stays inside. But if it's a younger child, they can still be seen from the house, but depending on how hot it gets and how soon it gets hot, that may or may not be an option as we move into summer. But certainly that's one thing to consider in these situations.
Yeah, we've set plans for active transitions between portions of sessions. We've also used white noise apps. Those can be very helpful.
So one of the things I've heard that I loved was for home visitors, they did something with the child first. So like if they needed to talk to the parent alone, they'd taught the kids a dance move, right? So they did like the Macarena or something like that, and then had the children go practice it in another room. So they had the music going, the kids were busy, the parent could talk to the provider, and then the children would come back in and show off their dance at the end. So active engagement, at least if you need to talk to the parents of the children in a way like that, was a very creative option, I thought.
I'm going to do that during my next meeting.
Isn't that great?
I want to see you with the Macarena.
Yeah, well, I know we're at time.
All right, well, we appreciate you joining us today. We hope this information was helpful. Our contact information is located at the end of the document. So if anybody would like to contact us, we're more than happy to respond. We appreciate your attention today and your participation. And we thank everybody for being here. We hope you stay safe and happy through this turbulent time as we all get through it together.
Thank you.